Welcome back to the Gregarious Technology YouTube channel. This video is a follow-up to the video I created on how to deploy your first MECM primary site as a standalone site. If you haven't watched that one yet, I highly recommend watching that first. Here, we'll be walking through the post-installation configuration tasks that are essential to complete your MECM build after it's installed. Let's go ahead and start off with an overview of what we'll be covering. First, we'll talk about how to configure discovery methods. What are discovery methods? Which ones are available? And how to configure them and which ones we might or might not need. Basically, discovering your users, groups, devices, etc. from Active Directory. Next, we'll talk about configuring boundaries and boundary groups and how they tie into things like client assignment, client device assignment, and distribution groups of content and those such things. We'll talk about the site default rules settings. And when I say default rules, those are the ones we install almost every single time during the configuration of the primary site. The first time we do it, the management point and the distribution point. Those two, there's some additional settings, a few of them, that we want to make sure to either confirm or configure. And then there's the site hierarchy settings. There's quite a few settings in here that control the behavior of things such as communications and upgrades and synchronization throughout the entire site hierarchy. But in this case, we have one single primary site, but we might have several site servers serving several roles. So we're going to control over the whole site hierarchy what those settings are. Next, we will set up the default client settings when you join a device to an MECM primary site. There's going to be a baseline of settings that you are going to enforce on the client device. And that's what we're talking about with the default client settings. We'll take a look at the options and which ones come checked off by default and how to change those. Or maybe add additional ones. And then we'll take a look at the site configuration, things such as maintenance tasks, how to perform backups on your site, and some cleanup tasks, etc. We'll talk about security. How do we create roles and administrative users for the technology staff you have in your department? How do we scope that? All that kind of stuff. Next, how do we deploy clients? Some basics on the client that they receive and the log files. And lastly, how do we deploy MECM itself version updates? An important note here, we will not be covering any kind of deployments here. Each kind of deployment, like an application or operating system deployment, those are all going to be their own separate videos. There's just way too much to talk about. This is really just finalizing your configuration so it's ready to go. and we'll have separate videos on all the other ones. So without further ado, let's jump right into our first module and talk about the configuration of discovery methods. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that for each one of the components we go over in this video, I'll have a hyperlink in the description section of the video, so you can check out the article for more details on what we're going over. The first thing we're going to talk about is different types of discovery methods, and that's found underneath hierarchy configurations. And it's easier to just take a look at it than to explain what discovery methods are. So underneath hierarchy configuration, if you go to discovery methods and click on that, on the right hand side, you'll see all the different types of discovery methods. So basically, you have to first discover your Active Directory forest so that MECM is aware of all the objects in that forest. And then it knows where to go. And you can limit this to certain organizational units later on for other types of discoveries. So you've just got to point it to your forest, so you can manage devices, users, and groups. And then you've got your group discovery, your system discovery, your user discovery, and your heartbeat discovery, and your network discovery. So we'll talk about each one of those. So let's first go to Active Directory forest discovery and take a look at that. So if we double click on it, notice it is not enabled by default. So we have to go ahead and click on enable so that we can discover our Active Directory for us. And that's what we'll do. So it's important to understand that the Active Directory forest discovery does not actually discover the resources, the groups, the systems, the users. That's why you have separate discovery methods for those. It simply discovers the network locations in Active Directory. So we use Active Directory forest discovery to discover Active Directory sites and subnets. And then we can create boundaries based on those network locations that are defined in Active Directory sites and subnets. But it's important to understand that those sites and subnets have to exist in Active Directory for them to be automatically created, discovered and then automatically created. Now, we're not talking about boundaries yet. We're going to get into that in a little bit, but boundaries are used for assignments of basically devices to like things such as just distribution points. When you have a dispersed network and such, you want to have your clients locate the closest distribution point, and that's done by boundaries or boundary groups. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about with Active Directory. And I'm not going to get too much into this, but notice with Active Directory, I have to have these subnets defined for them to become boundaries in MECM. And if we, those are the subnets on your network. They have to be defined in Active Directory first. If I double click on any one of these, go to the properties, I should say, it'll tell me which site that subnet is associated with. So, this is a little bit beyond the scope of MECM, but this is where it's going to get its information from. So if you have these defined, what we can do is enable one or both of these right here, automatically create Active Directory site boundaries when they are discovered. through Active Directory sites and services and automatically create IP address range boundaries for IP subnets when they are discovered, which is nice because then we don't have to type our boundaries in manually. So we're going to go ahead and do that. It's going to save us some time. We're going to take the benefit that those were already created in Active Directory correctly and use those and import those into MECM to use as boundaries to define when our clients connect by their IP address, which subnet they're on, which site systems they should be connecting to, management points, distribution points, those kind of things, to basically make it more efficient with communications and content distribution and all that kind of stuff. The idea is contact the closest management point, distribution point, software update point, all that kind of stuff. If you have multiple site servers that are, located on different subnets. And I would just leave the default because you can always manually run it at any point. So we're going to click on apply. Give it a second. Do you want to run a full discovery as soon as possible? Yes. And hit OK. And let that run. And we're jumping ahead a little bit, but I want to show you what that did for us when we enabled automatic discovery of boundaries. If we jump ahead just a little bit in our session here, and we go to boundaries, look at that. It automatically discovered our subnets as boundaries, created them as boundaries. We didn't have to do that ourselves. Otherwise, we'd have to do it ourselves. And it created the sites too as Active Directory sites. So that's why we want to make sure that our Active Directory sites and subnets are set up correctly ahead of time. Makes our work easier, especially in large enterprise environments. It makes your life a heck of a lot easier. Next, we head over to Group Discovery, Active Directory Group Discovery. And we're going to double click on that guy. And what we need to do is, first of all, enable it. Notice it is not enabled by default. So we're going to click on that button. And it's blank. It's not going to discover anything, even if we enable it, because we haven't told it what to discover. So you could say certain groups, but that's not typically what we do. Typically, you specify a location where your groups exist in Active Directory. So we go to Locations, and we have to specify the location and name of that location. Almost always, you're going to use the same thing for both. I don't think I've ever specified the name any differently, because what you're going to do is find the distinguished name of the organizational unit one at a time, or if you're going to do the whole Active Directory at the top level, then you're going to identify the DN of that. And so when you see it in the list, you know what you're discovering by its DN. So we need to go to Browse, is right here, and click on that and find the OUs, organizational units, that we wanted to discover. Now, we could just click on the top and say, find every group in my domain, but there may be just only certain OUs that you want to discover groups out of. For instance, you might not want to discover service accounts, managed service accounts, because you don't manage those through SCCM or Microsoft Exchange system objects or any of those built-in ones. So we might want to go, for example, to Tier 2 And I've got one called domain groups, and I'm going to add it. But you still have to add the name. So let's just copy that, do a Control A, Control C, and Control V. And at this point, we could just hit OK. But I want to point out one thing. It's easiest, I've said this in my other videos, to always use the site server's computer account for permissions. Otherwise, you have to specify an account and then make sure that account has the right permissions. But because that site server is added as local administrator on other site servers, and at this point, because it has full control on the system management container and can read, we're going to use the site server computer account. But you could have a dedicated account, and then you'd have to set that account, existing account or new account, and it would ask you for credentials. You would go in here. It doesn't see an existing one, so you'd have to go in here and say new account and create one with the password and verify. But we're not going to do that. We're going to use this option right here, use the site server's computer account to discover groups. Okay. Once we do that, we're going to hit OK. And notice now we could add another one. Since we didn't go to the top of Active Directory, we don't want to add groups manually because they can change all the time. And then we could browse to a different location. And you get the idea. I'm not going to go through all that again. And then every list of every group you add is going to be in there. So actually, I'm going to pause the video to make it not too long, and I'll add another group and we'll be right back. And notice now I've got two different locations that I'm looking for to discover groups, and it'll only discover groups from those locations and ignore every other OU. And I think that I forgot to mention this option, recursively search Active Directory child container. So if you just want the top level of that, then deselect that. But if you want to search every child container underneath that, then leave it as is. And we're going to leave it as is. Or you could have a combination of either. It just depends on your Active Directory and how you manage groups. And that's why you can add different ones at different levels. We could go anywhere in the tree, the Active Directory organizational unit hierarchy. All right. Then for most of these group, system, and user discovery, the polling schedule tab and options tabs are very similar, if not exactly the same. It just depends on the type of discovery that you're doing. For the polling schedule, I would leave it at the default unless your environment default schedule of how often it polls for new discovery for the deltas, and you could set the schedule and change it if you wanted to. But I would leave it at default because you can always manually right click it. And let me cancel this for a second and say run full discovery now, but we haven't actually enabled it yet. See? So we just lost everything. So I'm going to do that again real quick. And this time I'm actually going to hit on apply before I go to the other tabs, so I don't forget that I have enabled it. I don't lose that, all that work I just did. Go ahead and do that. Enabling it. Do you want to run a full discovery as soon as possible? Yes. But I haven't went to the last tab yet, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to change something in there possibly in a second anyways. Then we've got our options tab. And we can click on that, see what's in there. So notice we have the option to say only discover computers that have logged into a domain in a certain amount of time. I highly recommend that we click on this button so that it's part of cleanup, really, so that old computers that people forgot to remove from the domain or just, got destroyed or whatever, lost, stolen, don't show up there for forever, indefinitely. Now, when we get to maintenance tasks, there's another way to assist us as well. You can just get rid of them with the maintenance task. We'll talk about maintenance tasks later on. So you could say, okay, if they haven't checked into Active Directory in, let's say, 120 days, they don't exist anymore. And then when they check in, or just leave it at 90, because when they check in again, they'll come back. But in the meantime, if they haven't checked in 90 days, I don't want them, littering my MECM environment. So I'm going to click on apply on that. You could also say only discover computers that have updated their computer account password in a given time. I don't think it's necessary to do both. I would do one or the other. It's up to you. But I would probably discover the membership of distribution groups. So we'll go ahead and click on that. And we'll click on apply again so we don't forget about that. Just says it won't take effect until next full discovery cycle. And the last thing I want to say about Active Directory group discovery is that we haven't actually, groups can contain systems, devices, or users, or both. I mean, if you're doing AD correctly, your OUs should be isolated. You have OUs for groups and you have OUs for users, but they can contain both. And we haven't set up the discovery yet. So at this point, it's only going to discover limited information about computers and users until we enable that discovery method. Let's hit OK on that. And notice the top two are enabled, but again, we can always run a full discovery when they're enabled. But we already said to run it as soon as possible, so it's running. Trust me, it's running. And so we'll probably whip through systems and users really quickly for discovery. It's very similar, and very similar options. Double click on system, enable, apply. The only difference here is you got your add button here. And that's for your Active Directory container. So we've got to click on that to add the path to your Active Directory container. And on this one, you might want to do the whole domain. You might not want to go through every single OU, especially if you have a large structure, and just say, well, I'll just discover everything, all users. And again, we're going to do it recursively, which is right here. Since we're at the top level, leave that. And we have an option for discover objects within Active Directory groups. And we'll go ahead and just click on that. And notice we're going to do the same thing whenever possible. So we don't have to get crazy about permissions and a million accounts and forget which is which. It'll be a nightmare for you. Use the computer account of the site server as long as it's got the right permissions on the system management container and is a local administrator. on the other site servers. You should be good to go. We'll hit OK on that. Now notice there is an additional tab for the system. It's for the attributes in Active Directory that it's going to grab off of that system. So if we take a look at that, it's going to have some default attributes, some basic stuff that it grabs. But if you wanted to add some more attributes that it collects, here's all the attributes. You could add some more in there. We're going to leave it at the default for now. You can always change it later to add, and then do another discovery manually. We're not going to do that. Just know that option is there. And then we've got the Options tab, just like all the other ones. And we're going to do pretty much the same thing. Only discover computers that have logged into the domain a certain amount of time. Either that or the other one. And we'll hit apply on this. And OK. It's enabled, but I don't think it actually ran. So we'll run a full discovery on that. I thought the group one did too, but let's run a full discovery on it now. And now we're just going to go to user discovery, and we're pretty much going to do very, very similar operations on that. Discover users. First, let's not forget to enable, then apply. So let's go ahead and do that. Enable, apply. But we've got to also not forget to tell it to where to look. Otherwise, it's not going to find any users. So again, this may be one of those that you're like, well, I don't want to miss any OUs. So let's just go ahead and edit at the top level of the domain, find all users, and discover objects that are in Active Directory groups. And again, use the computer account of the site server. Hit OK. I mean, this should be pretty familiar to you by now. And hit apply on that. And it's the same thing with the polling schedule that we've seen before and the attributes. No differences on that. I mean, they're going to have different attributes, maybe, possibly, between system and user, but the concepts are the same. And hit OK. And it did not run a full discovery automatically, so I'm going to run one right now initially. Click yes on that. If we had enabled cloud management, which we're not going to go over in this module, you would see an additional one, Microsoft Entra User Discovery, and it's exactly the same as pretty much as the Active Directory User Discovery. But we have not configured that. I will have a whole separate video, and then we will talk about that in that video. Oh, and you would also have Microsoft Entra User Group Discovery as well. But you have to configure the cloud services, cloud attach, to have coexistence between MECM and Entra ID to be able to do that. And we're not doing that in this video. Way too much work. So I forgot already whether I have actually run that, so it doesn't hurt to run it right now. The group discovery is the one that would take the longest, because it's got to get all objects and all their attributes. The rest of them, the force discovery should be very quick. So the heartbeat discovery is the only one that is enabled by default. And that actually runs on the client computer, not the site server. And what that does is creates what we call a delta I think it's called Delta Discovery Record, a DDR. I just always call it DDR. And that helps maintain the database record of the configuration manager clients. So don't disable that heartbeat discovery. Otherwise, your clients won't be able to update the database with their configurations and status and all that kind of stuff. There is a note. It's a little advanced that Microsoft makes on this. If you change the, or if you enable delete age discovery data to clean up, make sure this runs more frequently on the schedule than the maintenance tasks when we get into maintenance tasks about enabling the maintenance tasks for deleting age discovery data. Otherwise, it's going to run into a conflict. So we'll just cancel that because we didn't have to make any changes. And then there is the network discovery, last one on the list, right here. That is not enabled by default. This would mainly be enabled only for devices that are not joined to the domain, such as SNMP enabled devices. And then you would have to go through the configuration in order for it to be device specific. So you would have to go through each one of these tabs. Enable network discovery is the first one. And you would have to go through the subnets that you want to search, add the subnets, domains, or SNMP, and add your communities for SNMP devices, DHCP, go through all this. We're not going to go through all this. If you want to enable network discovery to show up, it's typically not done, but it can be. Then I would recommend reading the article on discovery on this and digging a little deeper. I do have that article in the description of this video, like I said, but we're not going to go over this. It's typically not done. I'm not going to enable it. So we enabled those discovery methods for MECM to be aware of them and to be able to utilize them. And also on the devices and groups to be able to put those into what we call collections and manage devices and such through MECM. That's the whole idea. So once and we ran a full discovery on most of those. So where do those actually show up? Okay, so those are going to show up underneath assets and compliance. And we're going to get there someday. But we're going to do a whole nother video on creating collections and all that kind of stuff. But we're going to take a little tour right now just to see that it discovered those. Now, at this point, it's also important to mention that without devices, we've just discovered them at this point. Without installing the SCCM client on there, MECM has no authority to manage those devices. So we have to install the client, and we're going to get into that in this video in just a little bit. But for right now, let's go to assets and compliance and take a little brief tour and see if our discoveries actually just discovered systems and users and groups and the forest and all that kind of stuff so far. We know that it found the boundaries, that's for sure. Let's see what we got underneath assets and compliance. Okay, cool. So underneath devices, for some reason, maybe that's where I last was. It picked up our devices through Active Directory. That's cool. And if we go to users, let's see if it picked up our users. Sure did. Picked up a lot of them. But look at all this stuff we don't want. So one thing I failed to mention earlier when doing discovery, now we're back at, I quickly hop back over to administration and discovery methods, and I went back to user discovery. If we double click on that, and this is the same for, I think, a couple of these, and we edit this guy right here, what we didn't talk about was the ability of select or add subcontainers to be excluded from discovery. So that's very important. I'm like, wow, I got a lot of junk users in there. Where are they coming from? So I could browse or add. Oops, no, I don't want to do that. Sorry. Oh, let's cancel this. I messed up. I do want that as my discovery, but underneath the exclusions, I want to browse, and maybe I don't want the built-in. Okay. And maybe I don't want keys. Okay. And maybe I don't want foreign security principles. Okay. And maybe I don't want exchange system objects. Okay. And I'm going to add a few more. I'll be right back. So I got a whole bunch of them that I excluded in the list. And hit OK. I think I did. Yeah. And left everything else alone. Click on apply. Okay. Run a full discovery now. Yes. And then let's give it a minute and come right back to our assets and users and see if that cleaned up a little bit. So let's go back to assets and compliance. Let's go back to users. And it looks a little cleaner. I'm going to refresh it though. Now be careful. I'm running through this very quickly. But it's better to exclude than include because you can always include later and add. Once these are in here, you have to do a maintenance task to, well, we did it actually. We did the 90-day thing, but we would have to also do either wait 90 days or do a maintenance task to get these out of here. So they're going to show up for a while. So I'm not too worried about it though. And then we see some devices, and we'll talk about collections in a whole separate video. But basically you've got user collections and device collections, some default built-in ones. They're used to target basically configurations and deployments so that you can control the whatever type of collection it is. Typically it's a device collection, and you're going to see there's some default ones. Update membership, and hit yes and give it a little while. It'll probably update it, but we're going to do a whole separate video on collections and that kind of stuff and deployments. But that's what it is. But if we went to all systems, we could either double click on it or show members, right click and say show members. And it's going to show, basically it's a grouping. A collection is a grouping for deployments and management of the systems. But notice underneath the client tab, we haven't pushed a client yet, and we're going to discuss that in just a little bit. But I just wanted to show you that discovery actually worked. So when you see client no, what that means is we have not pushed the CCM client to that yet. We're going to get to that too. And the CCM client enables us to manage it through MECM. And without that, we cannot manage those devices. So keep that in mind. So that wraps up this module on discovery methods. Next, we're going to go into boundaries and boundary groups. So let's jump right into that. Okay, so we have to dig a little deeper into what is a boundary and what is a boundary group and what are they used for. So let's dive into that. Boundaries are something used by Configuration Manager to define network locations on your intranet. These include locations that define where the devices are that you want to manage. So that's what boundaries do. Boundary groups are logical groups of boundaries that you can configure. So a hierarchy can include any number of boundary groups. And these boundary groups can contain a combination of IP subnets, Active Directory site names, IPv6 prefixes, an IP address range instead of a subnet, and VPN starting way back in version 2006. So clients on the internet, client devices, evaluate their current network location and then use that information to identify their boundary groups to find their assigned site. And in this case, we're only using one site. But to find certain site system roles that they can use. So you associate a boundary group with these roles. For instance, you could have several management points or distribution points or software update points in your local area network. And you might want to point some of these boundary groups with these IP subnets that are closer to some of these site systems that are hosting these roles for efficiency and resources and network utilization and all that kind of stuff, or just to distribute the load between several site servers that host these roles. And so depending on how you set it up, you might have, for instance, 2 distribution points, and you might have a boundary group with several boundaries in it that if the clients belong to those subnets, they hit the one distribution point that are in that distribution point group and have a different distribution. Sorry, I meant to say boundary group. So you might have a different boundary group that has a different combination of subnets, and your distribution point, your other distribution point, is assigned to that boundary group, and any client that is has an IP address belonging to those subnets will fall into the range of the boundary group, which is assigned to that other distribution point, if that makes sense. So you have to understand one last thing about overlapping boundaries. It does support it in MECM. However, it does not set or apply any precedence or priority or deterministic ordering to this list. Instead, the client just chooses at random from a list. So if the client belongs to several overlapping boundaries, it's just going to choose at random which one it picks. So there's a distinction between a distribution point, and the other types of roles as far as a boundary group assignment. And it boils down to distribution points, and it makes sense. When a client requests content, MECM includes only distribution points that have that requested content. So if it doesn't have that application that's being requested on the distribution point that it's in its boundary group, then it's going to go to another boundary group to get that content, because it simply doesn't have the content on that distribution point. However, for the other types of rules, state migration point, software update point, and management point, it will go to the boundary group. The client will go to the boundary group that those role servers are assigned to. So that's enough talk about the logic behind boundaries and boundary groups and how they operate. Let's see how we get there, what we do with them, and how we assign them. So go to administration on the bottom left-hand pane, and then we're going to go back to our hierarchy configuration on the top left and expand that. And underneath that, you're going to see two separate parts underneath the tree, one for boundaries. And just below that, you're going to see one for boundary groups. So they're separated underneath the tree of hierarchy configuration. So let's go first to boundaries and take a look at that. We actually already took a sneak peek at this earlier on in the video, and we did discovery methods and said automatically detect in the forest discovery method boundaries and create those boundaries, but we're not, that option doesn't exist for boundary groups. So notice over here on the right-hand side, when we click on boundaries, we've got two of the type IP address range. That's what it picked up from Active Directory in my sites and services. That's how I created my subnets as an IP address range. And then it picked up my two sites as Active Directory sites. And I can use a combination of any of those in my boundary groups according to how I want to deploy stuff, basically. In smaller organizations, especially if you're using a single site server for all of your roles, boundaries and boundary groups might not even come into play. And even into mid and larger organizations, again, if you set up your subnets and your sites correctly to organize Active Directory efficiently with your domain controllers, then you might not need to do anything else with your boundaries here. However, you can manually create boundaries and delete boundaries, I guess. If we right-click on boundaries and go to create boundary, it's going to bring up a wizard. And our options are, what kind of boundary do I want to create? An IP subnet, an Active Directory site, an IPv6 range, or prefix, I'm sorry, an IP address range, or VPN. We talked about that earlier. And then I could just say, well, I want to create another boundary, and it's going to be an IP subnet. Let's just say it's 192.168. My cap locks worked. dot 40 dot 2, and then CIDR notation of, let's say it was 16 bits. And I'll use that for my description and the actual declaration of the network. Oops, I guess I got to type it in manually. 192.168. And I just put in the rest of the stuff. My network, I had to type it in, subnet mask, type it in, subnet ID, all that kind of stuff, and hit cancel. I'm sorry, hit apply and okay. But I'm going to cancel it because it's going to overlap with one of my other subnets. So I'm not going to do that. But of course, you could do any of the other ones. It's pretty easy. Not going to spend a lot of time on that. And you could delete as well, or modify if you made a mistake. Now you can add them to a boundary group from here by going to properties. And I don't have any boundary groups yet. You could add them to site systems. I don't have anything that's showing up right now. So we need to switch over to boundary groups and create some of those. So we'll click one below and go to boundary groups. And there's always one called the default site boundary group. And again, smaller organizations, even mid-sized organizations, may just use the default site boundary group or just the boundaries themselves when they're assigning distribution points, management points, and those kind of things. You don't have to use multiple boundary groups or boundary groups themselves. But I'm going to show you how we can do this. So for instance, I might want to create, again, by going right-clicking a boundary group, which is just like I did boundaries, and say create boundary group, and call it something like all sites. And then down at the bottom, click the add button. And what we're going to do is we're going to add the boundaries that we want in that boundary group. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to pick these two sites. Those are all my sites. Just giving you an example here. And then I'm going to go to references, and I have the ability to say, use this boundary group for site assignment. And then I have the ability to choose the types of site systems that I want. Now, notice, because I don't have a separate distribution point, nothing else came up in the list. We'll just call that all sites boundary group. And click on apply. And okay. And we could have just not created another boundary group. And we could have just selected the default site boundary group and just added the site server, the only one we have, site system, in our primary site to the default one and been done with it. Everything's just going to hit that one. And if you only have a single server, that's the way it's usually done. Smaller environments. You can only add distribution points to other boundary groups. So up here in the other roles, you can't change. So you have to go to the boundary groups. It's been a while. And add the complete site system with all of its roles, like we were talking about earlier, underneath the boundary group. And then when you go to the site system and you take a look at any of the roles on there, there's no option to choose because it's already chosen in the boundary group up above, except for the distribution point. And the only thing we can really do, if we remove this, I just tested it, the all sites, it's going to remove it from the whole server. The only thing we can do is add more. Because we were talking about there's a difference with the distribution of content. If that content isn't on that distribution point, then we can add the distribution point with that content to other boundaries. And that's why it's different. And it makes sense now. So you can only add other boundary groups to a distribution point role, but a site system for all the other roles has to be on, when you assign a boundary group, all the roles on that site system are in that boundary group. The distribution point, you can add other boundaries so that it can be available to other boundaries. But if you remove anything in here, it may remove it from all of the roles on the site server, including the management point, fallback point. So you have to be careful on that. Boundary groups. There we go. Okay. So we go to the boundary group, go to properties and references, and either choose this or don't, and associate it to an entire site system, and it will get assigned to all the roles on that site system. The only addition we can do is to say that on that site system that we assigned the boundary group, we can assign the distribution point role to additional boundary groups so that it's available in case those other site systems in those boundary groups, those other boundary groups don't have the content that this site system has for content. Hopefully that makes more sense. And lastly, as a wrap up, you can show the members and it'll show you all the boundaries in the boundary group. We already saw how to, I'll take you back to boundaries, add boundaries to the group. By default, you're going to have the default site boundary group. You see how that I took away underneath references on the all sites boundary group. I took out this reference for the server and assignment, default assignment, so I could go back here and do it to the default one if I wanted to for references. And it goes to this by default. And hit OK. And that's pretty much all there is to boundaries and boundary groups. Again, I've got the hyperlink to the article on boundary groups in the description on this video, so check that out. And next, we're going to go on to the site hierarchy settings. So let's jump right into that. In this module, we'll be going over the site hierarchy settings, the site configuration, and the site roles. And it makes sense to lump all those together because they're all interrelated and they're all in the same section of MECM. So in order to get there, we're going to go on the bottom left to the navigation pane underneath administration first. And we're going to click on that. So let's go ahead and go there. Then we've got to expand hierarchy configuration. Then we've also got to expand site configuration. And underneath site configuration, we will be taking a look at both sites, the site as a whole, and then the servers and site system roles. So basically, anything you configure underneath the site is for the whole site in the hierarchy, and anything that you configure underneath servers and system roles is for the site systems and the roles in those site systems. So we'll start with sites. So clicking on sites, we're going to see up top a whole bunch of options that we're going to kind of walk through for the site. We're not going to go through every single one of these, but we'll talk about most of those. And that's what we're going to use these individual buttons or menu buttons, I should say, to finish our configuration on the site itself. And notice that it lists the site itself that you're configuring in the version right up top here. So the first button, Add Site System Roles, is if you've got an existing site system in the hierarchy and you want to add an additional role. Let's say we have a new server that we haven't added to MECM as a site system yet, and we want to add it as a site system and install a role. Then we would go to the second one, not only to make it a site system, but to install a role. So it just depends on whether it's an existing site system or whether it's a server that you spun up and you need to create it as a site system and add roles to which option you're going to choose. So we're going to go through the second one because when you create a site system server, it'll bring up the roles option that you would see in the first one anyways. So we'll go ahead and click on Create Site System Server. And it brings up a wizard for us. So we first have to pick the server that we want to make a site system in this section here. So we'll just go ahead and click on Browse and browse Active Directory for that server. And the easiest way to do that is to go to Advanced. It's already going to have your domain up there, and it's already going to have computer objects. If you know the name of it, then just, specify the computer name. If not, click on Find Now and just look for the server, I should say. So let's say I want to install a certain role. Got to make a site system first in MECM. Click on OK. OK again. And it says, OK, I am going to make this a site system. and we only have one site. So that's our site code. And then we're going to go down to the section on which account we're going to use. I typically use the site server's computer account to install the system, which is the actual server, the site server that we're on, that we installed MECM on. And so there's two requirements for that to happen. And those requirements are the same whether it's a dedicated service account that you use or whether it's a service, the site server itself that is going to be used to install this. It first has to be a local administrator on the server that you're installing the site system and the roles on. You have to add it to the local administrators group. However you want to do that manually, it's probably the easiest, or through group policy, I guess you could do it that way. But if you have a limited number of servers, you just add the site system server to the local administrator on those other servers that you want to have roles on. Secondly, you have to make sure that your group policy enables access this computer from the network and the security policy for those target systems. Otherwise, this is not going to work. Microsoft recommends in a single forest to not check allow connection fallback to NTLM. And if you're interested in that, just click on the hyperlink shown in that description. So we'll go ahead and click on next. We're not going to finish the wizard. I'm just going to show you how we get started here. It's pretty straightforward. That server isn't even up and running yet. I don't have a proxy server. Just going to click next. And then you're just going to simply choose one or more roles that you want on the site system that you're going to deploy. Now, it's important to make sure that you reference the documentation for the prerequisites, all the roles and features and software, just like we did in our installation video. Look up that document from the description. I'll put the link in the description of this video too on the prerequisites. You can reference it from this video as well. But when you run through this wizard, the wizard will check the destination system to make sure that all the prerequisites are met before it will allow you to create the site system and install the roles on it. So we would hit next. You know, this server, like I said, I'm just showing you the wizard. It's going to fail at some point because that server isn't even up and running. And then for each role that you choose, you just have to go through the configuration that is involved in configuring that role. And that's what the wizard will do. So, not going to go through the entire wizard because some of these rules require a lot of work to configure. And I will have separate videos on things such as software update point and WSOS. I will have a separate one on reporting server. So just want to specify here how you would do that once you have the server up and running and you want to create a site system and install roles on it. And that's all there is to that part. So we can go ahead and cancel this. Again, if it's already a site system and you want to add an additional role, then you would go back here and say, okay, well, I want to add another role. It's already a site system, and use that option instead. Next, we're going to take a look at hierarchy settings And this is for your entire site. There's certain settings that you can control for the entire site in the hierarchy settings. And some of them may have been configured when we set up the site initially, but maybe we want to modify some of those settings or add some additional ones. And that's where you'll find the hierarchy settings for your entire primary site that we have created. So we will go ahead and click on that and take a look at the settings. On the General tab, the first option we see is to use a fallback site, which is different than a fallback server role, fallback site server within a site. So if you had multiple sites and you wanted to have a fallback site that was different than your site you're currently on, then you would click on the box that says use a fallback site, and then you could choose a different site from the list. But we're, again, in a standalone site, so we could click on this and that would be fine, because we want to use the fallback server, site server, one that has that role in our site. And just as a reminder, it says specify a site in the hierarchy to which clients are assigned when they are installed by using automatic site assignment and they are not in a boundary group that has an assigned site. So if you had forgotten to do that, then the fallback status point server would automatically put them in that site. And that's why you want to click on it. So we talked about boundary groups earlier and why it's important to assign boundary groups and for site assignment and some other stuff. And so this is just a fail-safe method of making sure that clients are still assigned to a site as a fallback status point. And then we probably want to click on this right here that says clients prefer to use management points specified in the boundary groups. That's the whole idea. You want them to use the closest management point according to their network location. I do not ever consent to pre-release features because it's permanent and it can be undone. So if there's a bug in it, you're stuck with it. So until they fix it. So I never checked that one. We did actually, in our primary site installation video, we covered this. By default, it's selected, but if you want third-party plugins that are not by default allowed console extensions to be installed or plugged in or whatever you want to say, configured in MECM, then you have to uncheck that. And the reason we did that is we wanted the Dell integration kit for drivers and HP 1.2. And so if you don't uncheck that, those third-party plugins will fail. So we unchecked that. And then we go ahead and click on apply. So those settings take effect. And that's all I'm going to do on this tab. If you want those other options, you can look those up and see what they do. Licensing should have been configured during the installation, so I'm not going to go over that one. Diagnostic and usage data is pretty straightforward. I usually leave that at the default, but I'll show you what's in there. It's just basically the amount of information it sends to Microsoft for diagnostic and usage data. I always leave it at the default, which is enhanced. Again, there's some links down at the bottom if you want to learn some more information on, which options you should consider if you want to change it. Use those links. Next, we've got the client approval and conflicting records tab. Definitely want to take a look at that one. So we'll go ahead and click on that. And up at the top, it talks about the client approval method. It says specify the approval method for client computers that do not use PKI certificates. And in this environment, we're using EHTTP, which is Microsoft's best practice recommendation. We're not using PKI. So I recommend leaving this at the default too. Automatically approve computers for trusted domains so that anything outside of a domain joined computer cannot be managed by SCCM, even if they try to manually install the client and site code and all that kind of stuff. But you don't want to manually have to approve every computer for the CCM client. So I would recommend leaving it at that. And it talks about conflicting records next. It says if Configuration Manager detects duplicate hardware IDs, and this can sometimes happen when you are migrating Forest away, which I'm currently doing a project for, from one primary site to a new primary site. You had two different forests, and they're formerly combined into one primary site, and you want to move them away. There can be conflicting records or machines that were offline for a while and came back online, or things such as that. How is it going to handle that? Because it's based upon certain IDs, like a GUID and a hardware hash and serial number and those kind of things to identify that computer. And you can have, in certain situations, conflicting records for devices, and then they're going to show up 2 or 3 times inside of MECM, and you're going to say, well, which one is actually active? So that's what this is talking about right here, how to resolve that. So it says, if Configuration Manager detects duplicate hardware IDs, you can allow Configuration Manager to resolve the conflict, or you can manually resolve the conflict in the records node. We're talking about the DDRs, and you're going to see of the monitoring workspace. This setting applies to client computers in workgroups and untrusted domain that do not use PKI certificates. Just leave it at the default right here, automatically resolve conflicting records. And you could, underneath duplicate hardware identifiers, it says some hardware is known to have duplicate IDs. Add them to this list for Configuration Manager to ignore these duplicate IDs for the purpose of Pixie boot and client registration. That's kind of what I was getting into earlier. So if it doesn't automatically resolve, you can say, okay, well, this is the real one. I will have all the ones that aren't real added right here so that Configuration Manager ignores those and only pays attention to the one that's actually active. And so all you would really do is go into add, and you can use MAC address or the GUID to identify those computers, and those duplicates will be ignored. Whatever you add here will be ignored by SCCM, MECM as clients, and thus anything that remains will be active. Next, we have authentication. So let's see what's in there. And this has to do with the authentication management of the security module underneath administration, the roles and the users that you're going to allow to administer MECM, where we're going to pick those from and to be available for those selections. We're going to leave it on Windows authentication almost always, not certificate. because we're going to add our, certain selected groups or users from our tech department. Typically, you would have a group for each type of role that you would have in MECM. When we get to the security section, we'll talk about that. And you would pick that group from Active Directory, so you need Windows authentication to be able to do that. So we'll leave it at that. And finally, in the hierarchy settings properties, we have client upgrade. What happens when there's a new version of the client that sometimes comes along when you do updates to the MECM site servers themselves? How are we going to handle that? And so that's what that tab is all about. We'll click on that. So in the client upgrade tab, it's talking about the installation of the CCM client, whether you want to automatically upgrade it when it's available. And I typically do not click on upgrade all clients in the hierarchy using the production client, because what happens then is, suppose that we didn't thoroughly test it, and again, there's a bug or it doesn't work the way you want it to. If we clicked on that, it warns you. It says you have selected to enable automatic upgrade of all clients in the hierarchy. This option will install the production configuration manager client and prerequisites in all clients in the hierarchy at or below the selected version. Click OK. Otherwise, hit cancel. I'm going to hit OK just so I can show you that you can exclude servers. And then you can select amount of days that you can delay that, so that you can thoroughly test. So maybe you could do this and then kick that up to, a little bit more than 7 days to give you to thoroughly test, maybe 14 days. And then if you have a problem, you can come back and just uncheck it. But typically, and we'll go over this later in this video and in the module when we cover client installation and everything that's involved with it. Typically, we'll test it first and then just manually deploy the new client to a collection at a time. So I typically don't do that. And then you have the option also of excluding specific clients from upgrade if you do choose that. And I do this though, typically. Automatically distribute client installation package to distribution points that are enabled for pre-staged content. It's not going to hurt anything. When we talk about distribution points, we'll probably talk about how to pre-stage and why you'd want to do that. So it's available. It's not going to automatically push though. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at the defaults, and we can change those later if we needed to. Click on apply and OK, and that covers our hierarchy settings. Okay, so now we're going to move over to configure site components and take a look at what's underneath there. Now, some of the things you'll see underneath here, these are basically the roles, the site components. Some of those were already configured during installation, and some of them are so in depth, like the software update point, WSUS configurations that will show you what options you have, but they're going to be covered in a whole separate video. So taking a look at what we see in here, we've got software distribution, software update point, which will be covered in a whole other video. We'll see what kind of settings are in there. Operating system deployment, not much in there. Management point, not much in there either. We've already configured that. Status reporting, email notification, that comes in handy. That's not pre-configured. And collection membership evaluation, not much in there. You can change that, but not a whole heck of a lot we're going to be going over in here other than to show you where to configure these options, and that for some of these, you'll configure it when you install the role, and they'll just show up in here. So first, we'll take a look at software distribution point stuff. So not a lot in here, but basically we're talking about the concurrent distribution of packages, the minimum and maximum number of packages that can be deployed to any distribution point at any given time. And that really depends on the resources available on the distribution points. I typically just leave these at their default. If you think that you have a super amount of resources in all your distribution points throughout your hierarchy, you can kick this up. And the number of retries, maybe you want to kick that down a little bit. 100's a lot before it's going to fail. And delays in minutes, maybe you want it to retry after 15 minutes or something like that. So you could change that. It just, again, depends on your environment and I guess your threshold of patience on the retries. That's all there really is in that. Underneath the general tab is where we're at. And then there's two other tabs, but probably not going to mess with much in there either. We've got the whole distribution point, which I don't even think we're going to configure. But I'll just show you that that option is available. And if you're interested in what a pull distribution point is, you can read up on that. But you've got your retry settings in there and status polling. It's just basically pulling from one distribution point to another. And then we've got the network access account tab, and in there, click on that. We're not even using a network access account because this deals with non-domain joined devices. I guess if your scenario is that you're going to be using SNMP for non-Windows devices or something like that, then you could specify, for instance, if it's going to use this account, and click on the Learn More hyperlink to find out how to configure the permissions needed for the network access account, and so that you could configure that for the software distribution. But we are not even covering that. We're going to assume that your devices are all domain joined. Cancel on that. Next, we have our software update point. Now, we're not going to actually configure this at this point. When we do our separate video on a WSUS and the software update point, also known as SUP, we are going to configure all these settings. But that's when you go to configure these. So these configuration settings will be discussed in detail in that video, so keep an eye out for that video. But the kind of stuff you'll find in here is you synchronize from Microsoft. Yeah, we don't want downstream servers or anything like that. Approved updates or not, classifications, what kind of classifications, critical updates, definition updates, feature updates, those kind of things, and for which products, all that kind of stuff is specified in the site hierarchy, sync settings, schedule, how often, supersedence, expiration, languages, third-party updates, whether you want to enable third-party updates for like Dell plugins and HP plugins for their updates for their software, and all that kind of stuff. And let's see what else we got. Yeah, maximum runtime, all that kind of stuff. But that, again, that's all stuff that has to be planned out appropriately, and we'll discuss and do a walkthrough when we do the video on software update point, specifically with WSUS. So that's that. Next, we have operating system deployment, and we only have one option underneath that. And specify a drive for offline, temporary location when it's offline. It says offline servicing of operating system images. They just temporary data on site server when processes run. So you could just have it do it automatic temporary drive for the temp files, which is what I usually leave it at, or specify maybe your data drive if it were D or whatever, if you want to change it there, to make sure you don't overwhelm your operating system drive with temporary files. And that's all there is to that. Next, remember, these are all at the hierarchy level, not at the site server levels. You can have different options at the hierarchy level. So management point, not much in here. It says select which management points are returned to clients by basically publishing to Active Directory and DNS. It'll create a record in DNS, but if it's published, we only have one. So if you had a list, you could just deselect ones that you don't want published and advertise to clients. Typically, I leave them all checked so that clients can find any management point that's closest to them. And because we extended the schema, this is automatically there, published, selected intranet management points in DNS so that clients can locate the management points through Active Directory. Makes it easier and more successful. And there's only one option underneath advanced options, and I don't typically figure that, but I'll show you what's in there. Configure an on-premises device health attestation service URL. I don't even cover that. Never even really mess with that at all, but that's where that location is, so that you could add the URL for the health attestation service. If you're interested in that, I just recommend looking that up. And that's all there is underneath management point. Next, we're going to go to status reporting. This is for monitoring the components of your site. So you have in the monitoring, you have a section, we'll cover monitoring for all sorts of stuff, but you have the ability to monitor your site as well as your clients and your deployments and all that kind of stuff. So this is where you configure the level of detail and what you want to capture. So I wouldn't say just errors in warnings, because you want to make sure your components are healthy with a little green checkbox, but you might want to check it to all milestones and details and click on log and just make sure that, you know, all this is in great detail as you want it, because if you're troubleshooting, then it's going to give you a lot more detail in helping you troubleshoot. So that's kind of important. So it's going to build up your log files a little bit more, but it's very helpful in troubleshooting. Or you can turn this on when you're troubleshooting, and then that way when you're running into issues, you can collect it in more detail, then turn it back off to reduce the amount of log files. So I'm just going to cancel on this one because this is just a lab server. And then last on the list, well, next to last, I guess, email notification. If you have like a shared mailbox, I would recommend that for the people that monitor the NOC or whoever monitors the health of systems in your organization. I would recommend that. You're going to need the FQDN or IP address of the SMTP server, probably a relay, and the type of authentication, which is in this next segment right here, next section, whether it's anonymous or you have to specify an account. And if you say specify an account, you're going to have to click on the account, existing or new, just like any other account we went over. But with a lot of internal relays, it's typically an anonymous relay restricted by IP address so that it can't be an open relay. So you might not need an account for that. And then the recipient address. And then you can just click on test SMTP server, which is right there, but I don't actually have an internal relay. I mean, this could be external too. But if you're using external to, let's say, to Office 365, then you're probably going to have authentication set up, unless you have a connector in Exchange Online for your on-premise stuff that receives it. It could be an external mailbox. But I'm not going to set that up. I just wanted to show you where that's at. It's probably a good idea to set up so that you can have a mailbox monitoring this, unless you have a third-party tool like SCCM or something like that that has an agent on here that collects alerts for you. But you have that option. And now the last one on the list is collection membership evaluation. So we talked a little bit about collections. They're just basically groups that contain either devices or users or groups to deliver basically applications, deployments, applications, operating systems, those kind of things. So when, let's say we have a dynamic query that says, update this dynamic query, you can specify right here that the membership rule, that query rule, evaluates the membership in X number of minutes, and the default is 5. And I think that's fine. You can kick it up. I wouldn't kick it down though. It'll cause too much processing in your environment. So, but you can change that. Basically, it says, okay, if I've got a query, it says, I'm looking for all Windows 11 machines, and you want it to update regularly to find new Windows 11 machines in that collection. Well, this is how often it's going to query Active Directory or look for those WMI statements that you've declared in the query or whatever kind of statement it is, to find those Windows 11 machines and add them to the collection, for instance. We do have the client installation settings, but that's worthy of a lot more detail than we're going to talk about in the hierarchy settings, because there's more stuff we have to talk about to decision making around this, planning for this, and some things to be aware about. So we are going to do this a little bit later on in the video, but whether you want to do automatic client installation throughout the site and upgrades automatically, or do them manually, and what accounts you use, and the site code and all that kind of stuff, we will cover that. It's just a little later in the video. So we're going to skip over that for right now. And next we have your site maintenance, your tasks, a whole list of tasks that you can set up to maintain your site. These are like cleanup tasks, backup tasks for your entire site. So let's take a look at that. Let's click on that. And it's going to bring up a list of all the tasks. We can click on enabled to see which ones were enabled during install or by default. Now, I did include the hyperlink and site maintenance tasks in the description part of this video. Each one is going to be have separate options and going to be something that you have to plan out to make sure you configure it properly. But typically the ones I'm most concerned with is the delete aged ones like discovery data. You know, is that enabled? And how often does that run? And on which day? What's the schedule look like? So that if it's past 90 days, when does it actually, that discovery data that we had set up earlier on in the video, how often does it delete that data? Inventory data, that one too, same thing. So the aged ones, let's see. There's another one I know I want to do, but I think there's an so for sure we want to do the backup site server. The reason is in case you ever have a disaster and you need to recover, this backs up things such as the registry of the site server, primary site server. It backs up all the installation files and updates. It backs up the SQL database so that you can totally recover. And there's a whole recovery process that you have to go through. But it backs up all that stuff so that even if the server just completely failed, if you set the backup location to a network shares, for instance, in the paths, and you're loading it or you're backing it up regularly, I would say use an UNC. Don't use a local drive in case that VM crashes or whatever, or a physical machine. And then browse for the destination, find that network share, and back it up daily. Now, we'll overwrite it daily, so there is a batch file that you can create. And if you're interested in knowing how to create that batch file so that it keeps X number of copies, of course, that's going to take up more space because it's going to be at least several hundred meg, maybe more than that, maybe a couple gig. But you definitely want to do this because you can totally recover your entire primary site from a backup. So I'm including that hyperlink as well inside of the description in this video. A little bit more to look at, but you definitely want to configure this one. It's going to save your butt. Now, the process isn't easy, but it works well. I've recovered many, many times in disaster scenarios, everything. Content, basically is a little different than the database, but even if you had to rebuild content, at least you've got your entire site back up and running. And if you're doing a migration, it's not an emergency scenario. Well, then it's even easier. Then you can copy the contents as well. So you definitely want to enable that task. But in my environment right now, I'm not going to do that. And you can also, right down here, enable alerts for failures. And recommend doing that so you know if it failed. If it's a permissions issue or something like that, You'll get an alert in the monitoring section of the administration pane over here on the bottom left-hand corner. And that's pretty much it for the where we're at right now, which is, as a review, the sites section of the hierarchy. Next, we're going to move down to the individual servers and the roles on those servers, and we're going to have a little bit more granularity over each server and each role, configuring those. Okay, so the only thing left to talk about to wrap up our conversation on the site hierarchy, the site servers, and the roles and configuration, final configuration after deployment of your primary site, is to talk about the servers and the roles on them themselves. So we're going to go to the next child category underneath site configuration, and we only have our primary site server. And so what we see is that listed right here. If you had other site systems besides the primary site server, you would see those systems in the list. And when you click on that, you're going to see all the roles that are installed per site system or the site server. The site server stands for the first server, or you could have a couple of them, I guess, that manages the entire site, as opposed to a site system, which just has certain rules on it. So down below, you see all of the roles that are installed on this site system, but this site system happens to also be the site server for our primary site. And you can see that right here. It's a site server, and it says the main site system that hosts the configuration manager components and services, but it's also a site system. A server or server share that hosts one or more system roles. So I hope that's a little bit clearer now, the distinction between a site server and a site system. But inside of here, we're really only going to focus on finishing up the install tasks. And there's really not much to configure in here anyways, other than distribution point and management point. So we're going to look at the options in there and what we need to finalize for configuration, because some of it was set when we installed the primary site and chose to host those roles on the primary site server. So if we didn't, then they wouldn't show up here. Those were optional. We had the wizard install those for us. So there's some options that are already set in there, but we'll go through those options. So let's start with distribution point, because that's got the most available configurations, and there's a very important one in there that we have to configure, actually two of them. So let's double click on that and see what it comes up with. So the first thing we see is we have the ability to give it a description. It does not come with a description by default when you install it through the wizard. If you create new distribution points, you can specify that during the installation of distribution points. So we're going to call this the site server distribution point to easily identify it. And then we have the ability to enable branch cache. So it says enable and configure branch cache for this distribution point. So if we click on that, we have the ability to use branch cache. And what branch cache is when you enable this, client requests, client devices, they request content from this server, and then the client downloads that content locally and caches the content. So that content could be applications, operating system deployments, etc. And that client then makes the content available for additional branch cache enabled clients on the same subnet that also cache the content. Additionally, other clients on the same subnet don't have to download content from the distribution point. The content is distributed across multiple clients for future transfer. So what this does is it makes it a little more efficient. Branch caches are client computers that contain content only. They're not going to serve as a full distribution point, but it distributes the load throughout your subnet and utilizes those resources. So it's a neat kind of feature. If you want to use it, it's really just optional. But if you're in a larger network, large subnets, you might want to enable this and configure it. I don't ever mess with bandwidth unless we're going across a WAN that has a really slow link. Like in some parts of rural America, you might still have slow links between sites. So that possibility, which kind of goes hand in hand with this next one, is pre-staged content. What is it? It's the ability to upload to the content locations on a distribution point and then have those be available for the distribution point by other means. For instance, I've seen this in the past, again, when there was a slow WAN link between sites. A technician just basically took the content from one distribution point, drove across the county, and we had pre-staged content enabled and dumped it on the other distribution point because it would be so slow and time out and crash the WAN link and everything that it was easier just to really hand deliver or like overnight ship a hard drive to the other location because there was such a slow connection between the distribution points that instead of recreating the content on each distribution point and possibly having a version conflict on every single package you create, you can enable this option. And so we don't forget, we will click apply on this. And the last one has to deal with, it says enable the distribution point to be used as Microsoft connected cache server. That's cloud stuff. We're not going to get into that in this video. Next, we're going to take a look at the communication tab up top. And this was already set by what we specified in the wizard. We chose eHTTP. And because in the wizard, when we set our first primary site and installed it, we said any site system can choose whether they want eHTTP or HTTPS, or just plain up restrict it to HTTPS. So we could change that because we installed, we enabled that option per server when we set up our primary site. Otherwise, we'd be stuck with one or the other, whatever we chose. And we're going to leave it on that. But because I was messing around and I clicked on that, it's going to want us to import a certificate for HTTPS. Now, again, that's beyond the scope of MECM and configuration, setting up the final configuration, all that kind of stuff. PKI infrastructure. You basically just need that and import the certificate. I'm going to set it back to EHDP and click apply so it doesn't ask us for that. Yeah, see, I'm sorry. Create a self-signed certificate. Got to go back to that. So now we're back to where we need to be. That's how EHTTP works. It works on the self-signed certificate, so you don't need a third-party certificate or certificate authority internally or anything like that. Now, I've seen issues where something went wrong, a server crashed or something like that, and there was a problem with the self-signed certificate. Really easy to resolve. All you have to do is change the date and click apply, and it applies a whole brand new self-signed certificate, and that usually takes care of the issue. If we're still around by 21-25, then I might be worried, but I'm really not worried about that. And that's why Microsoft recommends EHTTP with the self-signed certificate. Much less to manage, very secure, easy to remediate, all those kind of stuff. And so the next tab is probably the most important one for imaging operating system deployment, using Pixie Boot to image a computer, basically hitting, striking like the F12 key, I believe. I forget now. Depends on the system. To boot to Pixie, which means it looks for a Pixie indicator from DHCP to tell it where the Pixie boot server is that contains the boot files from TFTP server, basically a little mini TFTP server, it used to be anyways, which contains the boot files to boot a mini OS, and that mini OS in MECM. We do have boot files. We'll get into that when we talk about the operating system deployment in a separate video, get into all of that. But we have to enable Pixie. It doesn't come by default, Pixie Boot, on the distribution point to be able to boot to that distribution point, to grab the boot files and be able to boot into, the pre-environment installation for operating system images. So let's take a look at that real quick. So this is very important. You do not, in the old days, we had to install Windows Deployment Services, WDS, ahead of time. For Pixie, it was a requirement in older versions of SCCM. That has changed. You can still use WDS as an option, but we also have an option to enable Pixie without WDS. So you never want to install and configure it ahead of time, even if you are going to use a WDS version. So when we click right here, where it says enable Pixie support for clients, you are going to have some more options underneath it. So let's go ahead and click on that. And it just tells you what ports it's going to use to make sure those are connected on the site server through the firewall. They're open. And so, just hit yes on that. And then you're going to have some other options. Here's where you make your choice. Direct from the Microsoft documentation. When you enable Pixie, Configuration Manager installs Windows Deployment Services on the server if necessary. WDS is the service that supports Pixie Boot to install operating systems. After you finish a wizard to create the distribution point, Configuration Manager installs a provider in WDS that uses the Pixie Boot functions. You can enable Pixie on a distribution point without WDS. So all you have to do is click on this button right here. Okay. And this is a much simpler configuration and approach. And this is Microsoft's new way of doing it and recommended approach. But it's going to tell you this option enables a PXE responder on the distribution point without requiring WDS. Because WDS is not required, the PXE enabled DP distribution point can be a client or server operating system. This action disables WDS. Therefore, this distribution point cannot use multicast. Disabling this PXE responder enables WDS. Okay. So it's just asking, are you sure you want to enable the PXE responder without WDS? Yes. So when we click that option, the next tab, multicast, it's going to be all grayed out because when we use this option, it can't use multicast, but it doesn't matter. This is a much simpler approach. But it's still not going to work at this point, this distribution point, to respond to PXE requests. We have to click on allow this distribution point to respond to incoming PXE requests, along with the next option, which is enable unknown computer support, so that we don't have to go in there into, and again, you'll see this when we get into operating system deployments, that video, and grab the MAC address from the computer and add it to a collection that we deploy operating systems to. When you click on enable unknown computer support, and it gives you another warning, basically, if the computer isn't already in the database as a client computer, a known computer, it allows you to use PXE to boot to and deploy an operating system. And then you have to enable this distribution point to respond to incoming PXE requests. And the best way to protect unintentionally booting to PXE and causing confusion for end users if they hit the wrong key, and having the ability to boot to an operating system deployment through a task sequence, is to put a password on PXE. And that way they can't just get into PXE to boot to a boot image and grab any task sequence off of there. So you typically put a password on here, a strong password that can't be guessed by anybody. So it can't be unintentionally or intentionally somebody trying to wipe out their system through a PXE boot. So you would go in there and just put in a password, and that will avoid that whole thing. Can't even boot into PXE without the password. Okay. You can also choose to enable preferred management points for PXE requests, especially in larger environments, so that you can better direct traffic for PXE requests. And then it's going to give you a list of your distribution points. Your management points for your distribution points for your PXE. In this case, we only have one, so we're not going to enable that. And if your server has several network interface cards, several NICs, you probably want to make sure it's not going to try to respond to PXE requests on like the storage network interface or a dedicated VLAN that's for servers only or something like that. So you would probably want to click on respond only to Pixie requests on this network interface, and then click on the add button right here and choose the network interface card, the NIC that you want it to respond to. So you'd have to get that MAC address off of that NIC card, because remember, TCP/IP hasn't kicked in yet. So basically you would go to, on this computer, see if I can remember how to do that. I think it's get MAC. I don't remember if that's all one word or two words. Yep. And so for every network interface card, it's going to give you the physical address. You have to know which network card that is, but I've only got one. So you just basically copy that and say, here's the MAC address. Oh, come on, paste that. Okay. And then it's only going to respond on the network interface that's client facing, client device facing, and not any other network interface. Click on apply. For a good measure, when we are done configuring this distribution point, we would probably want to reboot the server after enabling Pixie. Like I said earlier, when we enable Pixie without WDS, we should expect every option in multicast to be grayed out, and sure as heck it is. So nothing to configure in there. And then we have the group relationships tab. And this is talking about distribution point groups, which we didn't really get into. You would actually see that, and they're really easy to create. Right over here, it's just basically a grouping of distribution points. And when you do that, it allows you to have those distribution points automatically synchronize packages, content, when you create it. So you don't have to manually create the packages or export them or anything like that on all of your distribution points. So I created one ahead of time so that we can use it for reference. And it's a good idea to do that, so that when we go to group relationships, and all we have to do is click on add, and then I called mine all distribution points, found mine, and now that this distribution point will be added to that distribution point group along with any other distribution points that we put in the group, so that when you create content, that content will be in all the distribution points in that group. Now, again, when we go to create packages, we also have we'll see this later in a different video, I should say. You have to distribute the content, and you have the option of selecting certain distribution points to deliver the content to, or you can distribute the content to all distribution points by clicking on the little radio button at top and selecting all the distribution points. But we saw in the site hierarchy that we saw the option to fail over to another distribution point if this one wasn't available. So that's the group boundaries. That's a good idea to do. And you may also want to do this because you might want certain content in certain geographical locations and different content in other locations, and group those distribution points. This is just one example, together into a group to better manage the way that content is delivered. And so we'll click on apply right there so we don't forget about it. And so the content tab is not really useful other than validation. We'll see that in a second. Basically, when you create content, you, as I said earlier, have to distribute it to one or more or all distribution points where to be available as content on those distribution points. And all we're really doing here is validating what content is on this distribution point by looking at it, and then actually we can validate and redistribute if we wanted to. But typically we do that when we create the package. But if somebody forgets to distribute it, well, typically we still go back to the package and say, okay, redistribute and choose your distribution points. So we don't typically do it through here. And then the next tab is just scheduling content validation. Basically, it's all it is. That's your only option in there. Same content concept, but you can schedule the validation of content. I don't typically get into that. But the last tab, boundary groups, is very important. You've got to associate this with a boundary group so that clients on the subnet that they're part of that boundary group know which distribution point to go to. So as a summary, Pixie and boundary groups are pretty much required to configure, along with possibly some of the stuff in general. But you most definitely, that's a part of finishing the configuration after a primary site install. So we're going to go to boundary groups, and we see that it's already associated with our default site boundary group, either through the installation wizard or we did that earlier in the video. I don't remember. But we do have another boundary group that we can associate it with by clicking on the add button. Now, we probably don't want to create boundary groups through here. We want to do it the way we talked about earlier, through basically administration and the hierarchy configuration and boundary groups. That's where we want to do it. But we can certainly add through here to say, okay, and that's the way you want to do it. If you don't see your boundary group in here, chances are it's not going to work to deliver content for that. So we'll click on add. Notice I have another boundary group. I don't have to add all the boundary groups, but this is how you isolate certain distribution points to certain boundary groups so that you can economize the traffic of where the clients on that subnet of that boundary group are going to go to the distribution point to get their content when operating system deployments and application deployments and drivers and all that kind of stuff need to get deployed to the system. But just to show you, you can have more than one. I'm going to go ahead and click on add, apply, and okay. And that's all there is to distribution points. So the last one we're going to talk about in the servers and site system roles, and basically wrap up this part of the this module, is the management point. So we're going to click on that. And there's not much in there other than a couple of options. So we'll take a look at that anyways. We'll double click on that and see what our options are. Now notice, just as with the distribution point, because we set it up this way when we configured our site, the management point can operate separately on protocols. So you can choose eHTTP or HTTPS. So when we set up our site, we said, well, each role and each server can independently choose which protocol, or if we didn't set it up this way in the initial primary site setup through the wizard, it would be one or the other on all site servers, all roles, and we didn't do it that way. So we have a choice. We're going to leave it at EHTTP because that's what we have decided on, talked about a lot in all the videos up to this point. Installation video of the primary site and the post-installation tasks, this current video. And then we've got the management point database. You probably don't want to mess with that, but for some reason, you have to. For instance, maybe you used a service account that no longer works and you want to switch to using the site server to authenticate to the site database, then you could choose that option down below and specify the name of the account that's a sysadmin in the SQL database that the management point can communicate with that database. And we've seen this quite a few times already, so we don't need to go through how to set that up. But you could switch back and forth as long as you set the permissions up correctly. So if you're having problems, but if you if you screw this up, you could have real big problems. So I recommend leaving it at use the computer account as a management point to connect to the site database, because remember a long time ago we said that's why we add, one of the reasons we add the site server computer account to all of the site systems as a local administrator in the local administrators group, so that it has permissions to do what it needs to do. We're not going to have multiple database servers. So we're not going to mess with the replicas and choosing to go to communicate with a replica instead of the site database. So we're really not even going to get into that. So we'll hit OK on that. And that wraps up this module on the site hierarchy, site servers, and site server roles, and finishing that part of the final configuration. Next, we're going to look at the client settings, in particular, in the next module, the default client settings. What are we going to enforce on the client when the SCCM client, the Configuration Manager client, gets installed? There's a list of options. So we'll take a look at that next, and that wraps up this module. So let's jump right into the next module. In this module, we'll be walking through client settings. So client settings in MECM are centralized configuration policies that control how the Configuration Manager client, the CCM client, behaves on managed devices once that client is installed, including features like hardware inventory, software updates, compliance, remote control, and endpoint protection. Basically, they define what the client does, how often it does it, and which management capabilities are enabled. When you install MECM, a primary site, it comes with a set of default client settings, but you can create custom client settings, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit. In order to get to where we need to be, we go to the bottom left pane and click on the administration node. And then we're going to see up in the top left, client settings has its own little node in the upper top left-hand corner. And notice at this point, we haven't touched anything. It's only the default client settings, whatever MECM comes with, whatever it's enabled and whatever it's configured out of the box. And you could go in and modify these settings. And these settings, these default client settings, are for all users and devices in the hierarchy. So if we modify this, the settings in this policy, it's going to be for all of those. If we want to apply different settings just to some users or devices, that's when we create a custom settings policy, and then we go ahead and deploy that custom policy or custom policies to collection or collections, depending on what we want to accomplish. So we're going to get into that in just a little bit. So the idea here is, if we want to modify the behavior of the settings that affect all users and all systems, then we modify the default client settings. So we would go in there and double click in there and modify those settings. Depending on each category of settings, they're going to have different settings we can control, and those will apply to every user or device in the hierarchy that the CCM client is installed on, the Configuration Manager client. If we need a different setting for any one or all of these categories, or just a few of them, for certain devices or users, that's when we create a custom client setting policy. And any custom client settings policy override the default settings. So if we change something, let's say endpoint protection only in a custom policy, well, the default settings for the rest of the categories are going to apply, but the custom endpoint protection settings and the custom policy for client settings are going to override the default ones only for the devices or users that we deployed that policy to regarding the collection that those users or devices are in. So we'll see that in just a minute, but that's very important to understand. And the lower the priority, let's say we had 2 or 3 different custom settings and some of the collections overlapped that we deployed it to, the lower the priority, that's the one that's going to override everything else, depending on the settings. But it may be a combination of, let's say we had the default settings policy, default client settings policy, and then 2 custom client settings policy, and we only change 1 setting in each policy. Well, it may be a combination of all 3, depending on how we deploy it. It's just a matter of planning and how you want to deploy which settings into which devices and which users. Now, I do have the hyperlink on each one of these settings, the article that goes over each one of these settings in the description on this video. So if you want more specific details on how, what these settings configure and how to configure them, take a look at that article. Specific, if you're looking at a specific setting in particular, then look at that article and it'll get into it a little deeper than we're going to do. We're just going to kind of show you what kind of settings are available and then show you how to create a custom setting and deploy it. So starting at the top of the list, we've got bits. If you want to control the throttling of the downloading of data, that's done through that. Client cache settings. If you want certain devices to be, we talked about branch cache in clients. If you wanted a certain amount of devices where that's turned on and other ones are turned off, well, then you could create a custom client settings and apply it only to that collection that contains those devices, or you could turn it on for all devices at the default client settings. So you're starting to get the idea. Client policy, polling interval. How often do we query the devices to gather information and push our policies and that kind of stuff? Cloud services, whether it's enabled or not. We're not getting into cloud services in this video, but keep that in mind. Compliance settings, you can create compliance policies that enforce restrictions based on whether the computer is compliant. Does it have things such as secure boot enabled or BitLocker, or does it have antivirus software, and is that software up to date? Those kind of things, but that, the compliance policy is separate from the client setting that says, do we want to enable evaluation? All sorts of stuff for the computer agent. That's the CCM agent. This one is one of those important ones that you want to look through and make sure it's set up correctly. For instance, in the software center, when apps get delivered, again, that's a whole separate video. What do you want your organization name to show up as? Some stuff with BitLocker. Use a new software center. Yes or no? You leave that one in yes, because that's the legacy one isn't supported anymore. Install permissions. Probably want to leave this at default for all users. This is configuring how users can install software updates and task sequences specific to MECM, not outside of MECM. So stuff like that. So that's an important one. Grace period for enforcement after deployment. You can set those kind of settings. So that's the computer agent, the CCM client agent. Computer restart. This really has to deal with deployments, whether CCM can enforce them and what the deadlines are, and required restarts and all that kind of stuff. Endpoint protection. If you have an endpoint protection point, all the settings for that, we did not deploy it, but all the settings for that are in there. So, they're pretty self-explanatory. Enrollment. This is really your mobile device management settings. Hardware inventory. Probably want to leave that on yes. Settings for that. You could modify the different types of classes that you query for. Those kind of settings for reporting and those kind of things. Or just when you look inside a device properties in the assets and compliance, what kind of information you're going to get out of the hardware inventory when you do that from the console. Metered connections, yeah, not a big deal there. Power management, kind of self-explanatory on that one. Enable wake on LAN stuff. You can enable that and set those settings. Of course, that would have to be enabled in the BIOS. Remote tools. This one takes a little bit of background work. You have to configure the settings. And, Windows firewall stuff and all that kind of stuff. This is the ability to assist users by taking over their device, and whether they're going to get a notification or see, a green banner and all that kind of stuff, so that you can, right through assets and compliance, find their computer, and the help desk or the support staff can assist remotely by having a remote session with their device that's in MECM. And this is often used, so that's why I'm spending a little bit of time on it. All the settings for that, so that they can help troubleshoot whatever issues without having to be physically at the desk, the computer, the device. And then there's the software center. Now, this has more to do with co-management with Intune. The software center is an MECM delivery application for any deployments you might have, task sequences, but more often applications themselves. They look very different. So you can switch, if you're in co-management mode, to using the company portal app, which is what Intune uses. And it's a whole new looking experience. And I don't think you can switch back once you do this. Could be wrong. But if you're sticking with the MECM software center, you have a little bit more of options on color and theme and all that kind of stuff. So that's important, very important consideration for co-management, whether you're going to use the software center, which is the MECM version, or the company portal. The company portal, not to get too much into this, will display software from both MECM and Intune, as long as that device is in a collection that's co-managed. So we'll leave it at that for now. Yeah. Schedule for the software deployment, some settings on that. Software inventory, same thing as the hardware inventory. How much information are you going to get out of that? What's the schedule look like? All that kind of stuff. Software metering. Yeah, not much to say about that. The scheduling on that. Software updates. This is another important one that you want to look at. These are all the settings for the client, for all, again, default settings throughout the hierarchy. If you have different, and we'll probably get more into this in the software update point video I'm going to do. Different, what we call automatic deployment rules. You might want to have different settings in here for different collections that you target with different software updates with the automatic deployment rules. So this is one that you might want to have a custom policy based upon the collection that corresponds with the automatic deployment rules that you're applying to that collection. So all the settings for software updates are in here. A lot of different stuff in there. And then we've got stuff that we don't touch much. User and device affinity, diagnostic data, pretty much leave those ones alone. And, telemetry and that kind of stuff. So you could set this to yes and say, I don't want telemetry at all, or it's optional, that kind of stuff. And hit OK. And those settings are going to apply to all users and all devices unless you specify a custom client settings policy and deploy it to a device collection or a user collection, and anything in that collection will get the overridden settings for whatever you put in that custom client policy. So let's go through an example of that. We are going to go to create a custom client device settings. And when I click on that, it's going to pop up with a window. And what I'm going to say is, I'm going to call this co-managed devices software center. So co-managed devices software center. And the only settings I'm going to change in this are software settings for devices that are in a collection that are co-managed with Intune. So what I'm going to do is click on the left and say, instead of the software center, I'm going to use company portal. And I probably should have called that company portal. But the actual name of the category is software center, so I guess it makes sense to call it that. So that I can deploy these settings just to the collection that has devices that are co-managed, and only those devices are going to have the Intune company portal, and all other devices are going to use the MECM software center. So notice I said to lower the priority. It will take precedence over the higher priority. So if we take a look at the bottom by clicking on Co-Managed Devices Software Center, there are tabs, and there's one for deployments. And if we click on that, this isn't deployed to anything yet. So even though it's got a higher priority, we haven't deployed it to any devices. So no devices are going to get this policy. We have to then right-click on this policy and go to deploy. To deploy it to the collection that we want to get those settings. And so we have a collection here called co-management eligible devices. There's no devices in there yet because I haven't set up co-management, but ultimately I want those devices to have the Intune version, the company portal app, instead of the MECM version, which is the software center, to deliver deployments, applications, operating systems, policies, all that kind of stuff. So if I click on OK, it's going to show up on the bottom right there. Now, notice you can deploy it to several collections. It doesn't have to be just one collection. And you can also create, going back to summary, you can also create more custom client device settings or maybe user settings. And then again, depending on which type of custom setting you're using, typically it's device, not user. I don't usually use user settings, but whatever. The lower the priority, the higher the precedence, and it's going to win. If there's conflicting settings, you may have a combination of deployments to the same collection, but they all have different settings because you may want that specific setting on several collections, so you don't want all the settings in one custom policy. So notice up top, if we had multiple custom client setting policies, these buttons would not be grayed out. We could increase and decrease priority of the custom client device settings or user settings, custom client user settings, by clicking on the policy and moving it up or down. It'll change the priority. Remember to go back to the article for specifics on these settings. That's the only way to figure out exactly which settings you want and how to configure them. But that pretty much wraps up the client settings module. Next, we're going to talk about, in the next module, security, administrative users, administrative roles, and scopes on those, and how to manage that. So let's just jump right into it in the next module. In this module, we're going to be talking about security, role-based access control, administrative users, roles, and scopes, and talk about the differences and show you how to set them up properly. I do have the link to the article that explains this in great detail in the description section of the video. And I do recommend reading that over because there's a lot more detail than we can go over in the video, but I'll give you the basics. So you can have a pretty solid fundamental understanding of how this works. My best advice is only give permissions based on the least base access control model, which means only give administrators in your organization access to what they need and the permissions to do it and the objects that they need to manage and nothing outside of that. So let's get started. If we go back over to our bottom left pane and click on the administration node again, we're going to get to the security section, which you see right here at top, and we've already expanded it so we can see all the different components of the role-based security that we can configure. So when we're talking about least need role-based access control type of model, we're going to see over on the left-hand side in the tree something called security rules. They have built-in security rules that accomplish most of the needs for your support staff based upon the common support roles in organizations. Only top-level architects and maybe top-level engineers should ever be full administrators. They have access to everything in the site and can change, modify, delete, add everything. The full administrator is the granddaddy of all roles. They have full control to everything. So if you notice, if you click on any role and kind of expand this, it gives you a description, both to the right-hand side, but below as well. It says grants all permissions in Configuration Manager. The administrative user who first creates a new Configuration Manager installation is associated with this security role, all scopes and all collections. And if you go through each one of these roles, you get a quick explanation, but again, reference the article. But they're pretty self-explanatory. If you want somebody that is an application administrator, then put them in this role. So when you create, and we'll see this in a minute, when you create administrative users, you can put them in several roles. It just depends on what they need to do to accomplish their tasks and duties in the role they have in your technology department. So, you can read up on those, and just remember, you can add up to one or more roles. One more thing is we can create custom roles. So, for instance, let's say I wanted to do operating system deployment. And if we click on that, we can see all the permissions that it has, but I don't want, I want them to be able to do certain parts of operating system deployment. I can create a custom role based off of this role by right-clicking and saying copy, and say, we'll just call it for convenience purpose, custom OS deployment role. And then I can go through and say, well, maybe I don't want them to be able to do, they can read boundaries, but let's say there's something in here that is in the rule that I don't want them to do. That wouldn't make sense on that one, but you get the idea. You can change it to no instead of yes, for instance. See if there's one that makes sense here. So here's one that maybe I don't want those that are deploying operating systems to be able to do, because it could cause a lot of problems. I don't want them to be able to delete the boot image package that we have deployed, because it could cause all operating system deployment task sequences to fail, and they're really hard to rebuild. So I may want to go in and say, no, maybe that's the only selection that I do in this, but you get the idea. So you can create custom security roles so that when you create your administrative users, you select the role, and you can even further restrict that administrative user to certain security scopes. So let's take a look now at security scopes, which is the next on the list. We'll talk about that a little bit. What are security scopes and how do they work? So basically, we have two default security scopes, all in default. But you can customize security scopes to restrict the types of objects that administrative users can see and manage. So we create our own custom security scope for that specific reason. So before we go ahead and show you how to create a security scope and assign it to certain types of objects, I want to show you which types of objects you can actually create security scopes for. And that is a section in the article that is in my description on this video if you go down to security scopes. So they have a list that you see starting right here of all the objects that you can actually create security scope assignments to. So basically you create the scope and then you can basically assign that scope to any one of these types of objects. So for instance, boundary groups. We've got also distribution points and distribution point groups. So basically you can further restrict not only by the role that that administrative user has, but what types of objects that role can manage. So we first have to just create kind of blank security scopes. So we might want to do one for boundary groups. Okay. Maybe we want to do one for distribution points. And maybe we want to do one for distribution point groups. So basically they're just blank security scopes until you go to something on that list and say, this is the scope that's assigned with, so that when you create the administrative user and give them a role and assign this scope, and that scope is tied to one of those types of objects we just saw in the list. So for instance, boundary groups, as far as the scope, we're going to go to some boundary groups, add those boundary groups to the scope of boundary groups so that we can limit that administrative user to infrastructure role with boundary groups. And maybe the same thing with distribution point groups and distribution points. So the second step we have to do is we have to go back, for instance, to distribution points and click on our distribution point. And what you're going to see up top on the objects that you can set security scopes on is a button called Set Security Scopes. So we're dealing with distribution points right now. I'm going to go and set this distribution point to the, not just the default, but because the default is for other administrators, distribution point scope. And then I'm going to go to distribution point groups and do the same thing. And you see, these wouldn't be available as far as security scopes if we didn't create them ahead of time. And we'll do the same thing with boundaries. In our hierarchy configuration, boundary groups, I'm sorry. So I'll click on both of these one at a time. Oh, I can't do the default one. Sorry. I can only do the ones that are custom. So now what we've just done is associated these object types with the scope that makes sense, the way we named it, what they are scoped to, so that when we create an administrative user, we can scope it to only those types of objects. So now we're actually ready to create an administrative user that's not full administrator. If you're going to create a full administrator, all you do is, so now we're looking at security and creating the actual user after all the legwork's done behind the scenes, all the planning on how you're going to implement your role-based access control and create any custom roles and security scopes and assign those security scopes. After that's done, you can finally just create your administrative users. That's why we went over that first. Right-click on administrative user, add user or group, and then we can browse for the user and find that user in Active Directory. Then once we find that user, we've got to click on the assigned security roles that we want to give that user. That's the next step. So we click on Add. And then here's where we can pick one or more roles. In this case, I'm just going to say Infrastructure Administrator, but I could also do Application Administrator. Okay. But the types of objects I chose make sense for an Infrastructure Administrator. And then again, you'd have to look and see, a description of all the permissions, or create a custom role and choose that custom role. And then we have choices down here on the bottom for assigned security scopes and collections. You could do all instances of the objects that are related to the security role, which may be typical for your support staff. Maybe you don't care to scope it any further. You just want them to be the infrastructure administrator wherever throughout the site they can manage those types of things that you want them to manage with that role. Or by default, you can add a security scope. And I can add one or more. So it just depends on how you want to implement your security. So you want to put careful planning into this. So basically what I'm saying now is for the infrastructure administrator, for that service account, they have the infrastructure administrator default role, which gives them all the permissions that come with that role, but only on these objects down here. But remember, if I did not want all systems and all users and groups, I can remove those as well. But, it takes careful planning. And then I'm done. And that's pretty much all there is to security in MECM. Typically in most organizations, all I ever see is creating users and assigning them to all systems, all users and groups, and default, and then choosing a role or a couple of roles that are built in to accomplish their tasks. But if you're in a highly secure environment, MECM can accommodate very granular permissions and scoping. And so you have to understand how to accomplish that if that's what you need to do. But this guy actually needs SQL permission, so I'm not going to mess up the database. I'm going to get rid of that. Yeah, that's fine. It's just telling us that we haven't assigned any administrative users to these scopes. That's fine. The scope should still be there. Yep, no big deal. And that's it. That wraps up our module on security, role-based access control. Next, we're going to get into the SCCM client, deploying, configuring it, and maybe a little bit of logs. Very, very important information to do post-installation of your primary site. Otherwise, the client may never get pushed to your Active Directory computers, and you'll never be able to manage them. So let's jump right into that module. So in this module, we're going to be talking about the CCM client. We're going to see the different installation methods. We'll take a look at the control panel and the logs for a little bit, and wrap up at the end with that information. I have included the hyperlink to the article on the client installation methods in the description in this video, so go ahead and check that out. We're only going to go over the client push installation method, but there's actually several methods that you can use, and I'll show you which one is probably the most popular. So we have, like I said, the client push installation method, and there's actually two ways we can push that. Actually, three ways that we can do that through pushing the client. And then we also have software update point based installation. We're not going over that. Group policy installation. We're not going over that. And login script installation. We're not going over that. And then, of course, manual installation. That's one of the methods that I still consider a push method, but we'll go over that too. And the article talks about all the advantages and disadvantages, and it's hyperlinks on how to perform each one of those steps. We're going to go through it ourselves. So the first way that we can do a client push installation is to go to administration node in the panel on the bottom left. And then once we're there, we're going to go back to site configuration, expand that, and underneath site configuration, and we saw this when we were going over site configuration, and I said, yeah, we're going to return to this later, and that's what we're going to do now. And we're going to click on sites. Same place for the hierarchy settings and all the other stuff that we went over before, but now we're going to dig into it a little bit. So this is automatic client installation, the CCM client, that manages the devices and all their policies and grabs all the hardware and software inventory information, all that. That's what we're talking about here. So we are going to go to the client installation settings and click on that. And when we do that, what we're going to have is two different options. We're going to see the client push installation, which is a method we're going to use. And we're also going to see the software update based client installation, which is the WSUS software update point SUP version of it, which we're not going to go over. So we are going to click on client push installation for our method for the entire site. And when we do that, what we're really saying is when we configure this, the client will be pushed to automatically on all computers that are discovered in the discovery process. So one of the discovery methods that we enabled was the forest and system discovery methods. So as soon as those systems are discovered in the Active Directory forest, that the timer starts, and the clients will eventually get the CCM client installed on their computer if we choose this method. So this would be for all devices that are discovered in MECM, automatic push. So we'd have to click on this. It says enable automatic site-wide client push installation. And notice it says this option installs the Configuration Manager client on newly discovered computer resources and on existing computer resources that do not have the client installed. And so that's the first thing we have to do. We do not want to allow fallback to NTLM right here. It's less secure and it's not needed. Only if you're having issues for some reason would you want to enable that. And then we have another section, and it says system types. So what we want to do is remember that any system, if we don't further declare which types of operating system it's going to install on everything that we have checked here. So I don't typically recommend installing it on servers. Typically those are managed in other ways, but you may, and you may want to do that separately and manually, which is one of the methods that we can use. I say only on workstation, and I leave Configuration Manager site system servers off the list too. And then we've got one more option on the bottom, and I leave that at default too, right here in this section. Specify whether the install, to install the Configuration Manager client on domain controllers when you use site-wide client push installation and the client push installation wizard. So I leave that at never install the Configuration Manager client on domain controllers unless specified in the wizard, which is really saying you manually do it. So this is saying for the whole site, anything that's discovered, if it's a workstation and not a domain controller or server, then automatically install the CCM client. So the last option really is only if you selected server, because a domain controller is going to be a server. So the last option really isn't needed if you don't select servers, but whatever. Let's keep it on just to be safe. Click apply. Now we go to the accounts tab and take a look at what's in there. It's got to have permissions on the local computers. And so there's a couple different ways we can do this. We can try using the site server system, and it'll use that by default. Or we can specify a service account by clicking on the new button right here. But in either case, whatever we specify has to be in the local computers administrators group. So you have to find a way to do that. So the site server might already be in there, and if not, then if you're going to create a user, then find one out of Active Directory that you created ahead of time for a service account for client push installation, specify the username and password, and then click on verify. But make sure that you've given the rights to be a local administrator on all those machines, probably through group policy. And there's ways to do that. So I'm on a domain controller. I'm at the top level of the domain, and I created a group policy linked there called local admin domain computers. And I simply went to preferences, control panel settings, local users and groups, and new group. And with the action of update, and the group name is administrators built in, you add at the bottom the service account that you create. You want to be the service account for the CCM client. Mine's called SVC_CCM client. And that way, through group policy, it will become a local administrator on all those machines, and we'll be able to push the CCM client. And we can specify that when we use that wizard if we don't use the site system server. But I'm going to use the site system server because I'm actually going to do it on a domain controller, and we don't have local accounts on a domain controller. But for the rest of the computers that are domain joined, this will work. So going back here, what we would do is we would browse for that username. We'll put in the password, and we'll click on verify. But for my testing purposes, I'm not going to verify. I am just going to add the account. So now, underneath going back a little bit, underneath the General tab, we're doing a client push installation for the entire site. Add our settings in there. I have an account for all the workstations. I added the GPO underneath preferences to add that account as a local administrator on all those machines. And the last thing we have is the installation properties. And on that, we pretty much just take the defaults. The site code equals whatever the site code is, unless you're doing a migration of some sort or something like that, and you have to change the site code and need some other parameters in there. And then that's all there is to this method. Again, this method is client push installation for everything in the entire site. And so that's method number one. Method number two is still a client push installation, but we're not doing it automatically for every workstation on this site. We're going to do it for a collection. And in this case, we excluded servers and domain controllers. So I'm going to push, do a client push through a collection manually. And so that's our next approach. And so where we're going to go now is to assets and compliance, and expand overview. And then I'm going to go, because this is where I have my collection, to device collections. And I'll find the collection that contains the devices, the servers. In this case, it's actually a domain controller too, that I want to push a client to. And so I have a collection right here that has that server in it. And so if we're going to verify, yes, that's the server I want. Okay, but we have to go back up one level to the device collection that we want to deploy it to. So we're going to go to the collection that we want it to be deployed to, the client, and we're going to do a client push manually to a collection, not automatically through the site. So we have to go to the device collections and find the collection. Don't open the collection. And what you're going to see up top is a button to install the client. And then it'll bring up a little wizard for us, hopefully. And that's what we're going to do. And it tells us a whole bunch of requirements right here. And I don't actually expect this to work because it's a domain controller, and domain controllers don't have a local administrators group, which will bring us to our third option. Unless there's something, because the system management container might have some sort of permissions or something like that. Or I could edit to give it full control on the domain controller's OU or something like that, some alternative method. But that would be a big security risk. So I don't actually expect this to work, but I want to show you what it looks like. So we'll go ahead and click on Next. And we'll say, allow this to be installed on domain controllers. Always install the client software. And if there was an existing version and we're upgrading, we could click on uninstall existing client manager client before the client is installed. We don't really need to click on install this from a specific site because we only have one site, but it doesn't hurt to make sure that it gets the right site code. Then we click on Next, Next, and Close. And then we have to take a look at and monitor to see if the CCM client got pushed. And that might take a little while. So I'm going to pause and come back with the results. For you, it'll probably be just a few seconds. For me, it might be a half an hour or an hour. Well, let's see. The one thing about MECM is nothing happens instantaneously. Things take time. So we've got to pause and come back. Oh, and by the way, this is the first time in my videos that I have so far that I'm doing an actual deployment. So down at the bottom tab, you see on any collection, there's a deployments tab because you can deploy just about anything that you can deploy to a collection. That's how you do it typically. And so if we click on that tab, it doesn't even show yet that this deployment is been targeted for this. So I may just try to refresh a few times until we see that. So it hasn't even realized that it's got a deployment yet. So we'll give it a little time. So gave it a few minutes, and I still don't see the deployment even listed. And I suspect because it's a domain controller, permissions, all that kind of stuff, which is great because that shows us the third method that we have to use sometimes on situations like this, which is a manual installation. And so we're going to go through that now. So I'm actually going to go to the system, the domain controller itself, grab the installation files for the CCM client, and install it manually, show you how to do that from the from the device, the computer, and check for a few things, the installation folder, the log file, and those kind of things. So let's jump on that domain controller and give that a shot. So I'm now on my domain controller, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Start and Run, and I'm going to type in / the site server name that has that distribution point. And in this case, it's MECM. Click OK. And what I'm looking for is a directory that's SMS _ our site code. So that would be SMS _ lab. And then we're looking for a folder called client. Now we're not going to run it straight from here. We are going to copy this. I mean, you might be able to do that, but we're going to copy this locally to the server. And so I'm going to go to copy it right to the C drive. This is the installation folder for the CCM client. I'm going to paste it right there. And I'll give it just a minute to copy. And then I'm going to open that folder, copy that path, log on to terminal as an administrator, change to that directory, and then if we look at that directory, there's the CCM setup.exe. We're just going to run that. So in PowerShell, I believe we have to do the /, but I'll just grab that name so I don't mistype it. Now, there are parameters that you can specify, the management point and the site code and fallback status point and all that. It's listed in the article that I gave you. You can check those out if you wanted to, if you run into issues. But all you should have to do in a single site, primary site, it should pick that up automatically, the site code, fallback status point, and management point and all that kind of stuff if we did our boundary groups correctly. But if not, if we made some issues or did some misconfigurations, we may have to specify those values as parameters so it can identify the management point, the fallback status point, and the SMS site code. So let's give it a shot and see what happens. Now, it's in silent mode, so we're not actually going to see anything. We have to go and check for files and logs, and then we can go back to Configuration Manager and see if it's listed as having the client installed and active. So I'm going to give it a couple of minutes, and we'll check the setup location folder locally and the log files. So what we're looking for is in the C Windows on the computer we're installing it on, we're looking for the CCM setup folder. So we know it started when we see that. So that's a good sign. And if we look in there, we see the files. That's good. So we know it started to install. And in the logs folder, we can check out the logs. So we'll go ahead and jump in there. And what we're looking for is the CCM setup.log. And I don't want to open that with Notepad. because it looks disgusting. So I'm going to go back to SMS Lab, the site share, and it should be right underneath tools, and grab that CM trace tool and copy it right to the same folder that we have for the client. Paste it right in there, and then run that, our CM trace tool that we've talked about before. And that way, when I go into go back into C, Windows, SCCM, setup. Now notice I also have my CCM folder in C Windows now, which is good for the client itself, not just the installation folder. So we go to CCM setup and look at that log file. I'm going to open, and I'm going to say Configuration Manager always, or CM trace always. I'm going to look at the log file. And when it has an exit code of 0 on the bottom, that means it completed successfully. If there's any errors and you don't see that exit code of 0, then we had an issue with the install. But you can see that it's still installing. So we'll give it a few minutes and we'll pause and come back. Okay, so I see some red errors and yellow warnings, but we can always go back to those. What I do see, what I like, is what I expected. CCM setup is exiting with return code 0. So I want to check one other thing out locally on this computer. So that should tell me that it got installed. What I should see in the control panel now is, and I do see it, this is the control panel applet for the CCM client. And if we take a look at double clicking on that, it might not quite be ready yet, but it looks like it is. It looks like all the tabs are there. Maybe they're not all filled out yet. Yeah. So if you go to the Actions tab, you should see a lot more actions in there. And you can run some of these actions, like you can force it to update its machine policy and its software policy and user policy and all that kind of stuff. It's not quite finished communicating with MECM yet, but the client installs is a success. So I'm going to close this out. That log file is going to stay there, so I don't need to keep that open. I've got the control panel applet open. I'm going to minimize this and minimize this just in case I have to get back into it. But once again, where did I get that CM trace from? From the site server, and then the SMS underscore site code, which is the same place that I got the client from. And instead of the client folder, I grabbed the tools folder and CM trace and grabbed that and copied it to my local computer. So a lot of stuff here. Let's give it another minute and see if it completes communications with the MECM server. So I went back to the MECM console. I'm in Assets and Compliance, and underneath Devices, just checking out all my devices. If I had a ton of devices, I could search up that were discovered. I could search up here for the device, but I don't need to in my scenario because I've got a small lab environment. But then I found my device, and I'm looking for a few things. Hold on. I'm looking to see underneath client for yes, that the client is installed. Yep, sure is. Then I'm looking for client activity. Yep, it's active. These are all good signs. And then I'm also looking for this little green checkbox that tells me it's active and healthy and all that good stuff. So the manual method worked. And on domain controller is typically what you have to do anyways, unless you circumvent permissions, which is really a no-no for security risk. And if we now go back to that server, that domain controller, we could see a lot more in the Actions tab. So it's communicating everything it needs to. Cancel this, just a real brief tour of the client actions. What you're going to see for the device, when you click on it, down below, you have a whole bunch of summary information, and then you've got a whole bunch of other tabs that tells you a lot about the device. So we can click on any one of those tabs and get information. You know, we're not using any of this stuff, but it's using the default client settings. Remember, we talked about client settings, any collections it's in, all that kind of stuff. And when you right click on it, you get a whole menu of stuff that you can, do now that it's a managed device. So you can go through any one of these, and, probably at some point I'll do a video on this, all the different options. But here's your remote assistance. If we configure that correctly, I could offer remote assistance. And do all sorts of, wake on LAN and, grab log files and push the policy evaluations, all that kind of stuff. Do some diagnostics, grab the client logs right from here. If I were using endpoint protection, I could force a scan, download definitions to the computer, all sorts of good stuff. There's a tool called, by default, it gets installed with the client, CM Pilot, Configuration Manager Pilot, and it allows you to query the device for a lot of built-in default information. I mean, here's just, I don't know which one this is. This must just be the general one we're on right now. Gives you all the hardware stuff we collected from it right there. We could go down to BitLocker encryption details. I think you have to, I think we have to query all or something like that. I haven't run in this in a while. And then on each one of these categories, you can query for more information. Really useful tool to basically do any kind of query that you want on the system. But I don't have BitLocker on here, so it obviously failed to get any results. So, yeah, I mean, that's the Configuration Manager client. So that wraps up this module. We went over installing the client with several different types of methods, the popular methods. Talked about alternative methods, showed you the article that, or at least indicated that you can grab that article where to get some more information and detail if you wanted to. Showed you a little bit of the features, showed you a little bit about collections, and log files and locations of the installation when it's being installed, and and the control panel applet, a lot of good stuff. We're going to finish up last with a very, very small module, especially since I'm on the latest version, about updating the MECM version to the latest version. And I think I'm already on it, so I might just have to talk about the process and show you how to do it, but I don't think there's going to be any updates for me to demonstrate for you, but maybe I'll get some screenshots or something like that. Okay, so without any further ado, let's jump into the module for updates. So before we actually get into doing an update or an upgrade in line, I want to remind you that we talked about when we went over maintenance tasks on the site itself, that there's a backup feature in there. So I want to revisit that really quickly. We're going to go back to administration, site configuration, sites, and site maintenance. We want to make sure that's enabled. And we also want to check that there was a recent backup. And I want to show you how to perform one if there wasn't. So taking a look, I just did one locally on my D drive, just for demonstration purposes, in a folder called MECM backups. It's automatically going to name it your site code backup. And what you should see in there, and you could check by date, is cd.latest. That's all of the installation files. It's a complete backup of everything you need to do to recover or restore or install MECM. You've got your site database servers in there and logs. Some other stuff for your SMS server. And then you've got an INI file, an XML file, and then you've got your actual log file of the backup itself. Now, if you don't see a recent backup, then you can always perform one manually by going to your services, and there's a service called SMS Site Backup, and you just right-click it and say Start, and it will perform it for you, as long as it's configured in the maintenance tasks as to where to go. And at least one day out of the week in the schedule, then you can always trigger it, and if you need to troubleshoot it. So it's always a good idea before you do an upgrade to do a backup just to be safe. So to check for dates and upgrades and all that kind of stuff, you're going to go to administration, where we've been the whole time, and updates and servicing. And it's really a several layered process. First, you have to search for any available updates. Then you have to go through a prerequisite check and resolve any issues with the prerequisites before you do an install on the updated patch level or whatever it is. Maybe it's a baseline release, maybe it's a patch level, whatever it is. And this is where people get into trouble. If you try to directly install, which it'll sometimes let you do, and you've got errors and warnings. Some warnings you can dismiss, but especially if you have errors, you could really have some serious issues on your hands if you don't do the prerequisite check and just try to do the install, or ignore the warnings and errors without looking into them once you've done the prerequisite check. And then once you've rectified all those the best you can, or dismissed it because it's a false positive, then you actually install the update, and it takes a very, very long time. And then, and it replaces some of the components, it reinstalls some of the components. And then you monitor it, and then you verify that it has updated. And the very last step we don't want to forget is that if anybody's running the management console remotely, they have to upgrade their console version to the version that's on the newest update. Otherwise, they could corrupt MECM. That's very, very important. So we'll go through some of that, but that's the general process. So we'll go to updates and servicing and expand that and see what's in there. And all we have to do is, quite honestly, right click on updates and servicing and say check for updates. But before we do that, I want to show you a way to check which version you're currently on. If you go to the arrow in the upper left-hand corner, you're going to get some hidden options that you probably didn't know existed, such as PowerShell for MECM, etc. But there also is About Configuration Manager. And it tells you right in there which version you're at. And so I can see that I'm at 2509, and that is the latest release. So when I do this check, nothing's going to show up in the list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through an article that has some good screenshots so you can see what the process actually looks like with a prerequisite check. You know, when it checks for stuff, what it looks like in the window, prerequisite check when you get warnings, and then the monitoring. It's a little bit of a non-intuitive process after you do the prerequisite check to find out how to install it. So I'll take you through an article. There's a really good article on it. But so I'm not going to get anything. 2509 is the latest. So I'm going to hit OK on that. But just for the heck of it, we're going to right click, check for updates, and it says checking for updates. You can click refresh to update the console during update the console to display recently downloaded updates. Blah blah blah. So we can hit refresh up in the upper right hand corner. But it's not going to find anything, or click refresh up here, because I'm already on the latest version. What we would expect to see is any updates that would be available would be listed here. And if you're several versions behind, you might have to do a double hop. And it'll tell you ready to install or requires a previous version, those kind of things. So let me switch over to the article really quickly so you can get some screenshots of what it would actually look like. Oh, and by the way, that article is listed in my video underneath the description section. So you can just view the article yourself. It's a very good article. It walks through each step and has some great screenshots, and it's developed off of 2509, the latest version. So I'm skipping quite a ways down through the article. By the way, these guys, systemcenterdudes.com, they're pretty good. They got a lot of good articles, and they're accurate. As you can see, and I'm going to draw another arrow here, or actually use a box. You've got ready to install on 2509, and you can jump right to it. It tells you that you're on 2503 already installed, and there's nothing in between that says you have to install that first. So you're good to go. But if you notice from the screenshot, what they're indicating here is to run the prerequisite check first. Do not choose install update pack. You have to resolve any issues, or it could be disastrous and you could break MECM. And you've got a lot of troubleshooting on your hands. You could have downtime and all that kind of stuff, production downtime. So it's very important to run the prerequisite check. So what does that look like? Well, it looks very similar to this right here. I mean, it looks exactly the same, but you might not get the same errors or warnings. You see any errors or warnings, you click on it and then look at the description below to figure out what's going on. It may tell you that there's a component missing, or you don't have rights or whatever. And so you've got to resolve them. And then you've got to run the prerequisite check over and over again until you resolve all the issues. And notice here on the right-hand side, there's a scroll bar. You can't see all of the different checks that are in place unless you scroll down further. So you have to scroll down to see all of it. Now, it's not uncommon that some warnings are just going to be warnings that you can dismiss as long as you've checked them out. But if it had errors, I would not probably proceed. And so when you get it to that point where you're confident it's going to install without issue, then you right click it again, and this time you're going to select install update pack. And then it's actually going to go through the install of the upgrade, update, whatever it is. And it'll bring up in a wizard, and this part is important. Ignore any prerequisite warnings and errors. Any prerequisite check warnings, and install this update regardless of the missing requirements. I mean, you've already checked everything out. If there's an error, or a warning, not an error, that you just can't get rid of and you think it's false positive, it's not going to be crucial, the wizard's not going to continue unless you click on that checkbox. So that's very important. If you see any additional unchecked features, I would not do that during the upgrade. I would do them after the fact. Just stay with what you've got, because you don't know if you've got the prerequisites, the roles and features. Some of these might be cloud-enabled features that you have to authenticate to, and you don't know if it's set up for that. Do not do that. The ones that are grayed out are the ones that are already part of your site roles in the hierarchy, and thus that's why they're grayed out. Don't add anything additional during the upgrade. Leave it as is. And so what this article is pointing you to is the fact that if there are some new features with this release, don't worry about it, because those new features in this release will show up right underneath where we're at, where it says features. And once the base version is upgraded, we can sort by off and on and see what's off. We don't have a central administration site, so I don't care about that. And see, this one's pre-release, so I probably wouldn't turn it on. But we got something with BitLocker management and approve application requests that are in release. Sound pretty cool when you look at them. After the upgrade, you can do those features. It'll be safe. Probably would run another backup first, though. Once you do the upgrade, do another manual backup. And that's what the article is referring to when it gets into this next section. I always upgrade without validating the client. Cause there's too many requirements. It's too cumbersome. Never seen an issue with it. And you're not going to push a new client out immediately anyways. You're going to pilot that with a client push to a test collection set before you upgrade the version of the client. So we're not going to do any validation here during the upgrade. So they're talking about the configuration manager client, the CCM client. We're not going to do any validation here. We're going to validate on our own afterwards, and we're not going to immediately upgrade anyways. And then there's a couple of generic windows about licensing. And, if you're in call management with Intune, those kind of things. And then, of course, the summary that I just kind of quickly glance at. And then what's going to happen is in the updates and servicing part of the console, it will say installing now. And if you double click on that, it's going to take you to the same screen that looked very much like the prerequisite checker. And it's just going to bypass any warnings in that. It's still going to run that again. And then it's going to actually install. And then you're going to get a status on every step along the way of what it's doing and whether there are any issues or not. And don't be surprised if it doesn't start immediately. Just give it some time, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something like that, and keep refreshing. It'll kick in, within a half an hour, it should. And then what they're pointing out here is that what you'll see is the installed status on 2509, which is the latest. I don't see that because I started out with the baseline installer of 2509. So it wasn't an update for me. So that's why I don't even see that in there, because I started off with the baseline installer for 2509. And on the site server, it's also going to give you this warning that it's got to close and reopen to install the newer version of the console. However, again, if anybody has a console installed on any other site server or any of their own workstations, all consoles have to be upgraded. You could corrupt this installation, this update, this upgrade, whatever it is, by using an older version of the console. I cannot stress that enough. Everybody has to use the newest version of the console. And they can find that console. Let me see where the installer is. Hold on a second. I was in the wrong location for a second. By going to, we'll see right here where I'm at, // the name of the site server, and then SMS_lab, the same share we've always been going to. And underneath there, you're going to see a tools folder. And underneath the tools folder, there's the console setup. So there's no excuse why they can't navigate to that from any system that a console's on and upgrade it. And when you click on console setup.exe, it's going to actually find the older version of the console installed and ask you to remove it. Or you could just remove it ahead of time and set this up to be safe. So then they remind you that you've got to go through the client upgrade, but we're going to use the client push method where we put a few computers in a test collection and we will deploy the client newer version by finding that client package and actually right mouse clicking on that package and deploying to that test collection first and making sure everything works before we upgrade the entire production hierarchy. Once you've successfully tested that, then you can go to, and you should be familiar with this by now, under Site Configuration Sites and Hierarchy Settings for the site. And underneath Hierarchy Settings, we've got a tab for the client upgrade. And this is after you've tested the newer version. And after that package is distributed to the distribution points. And then you can click on Upgrade All Clients. And it's just warning you, give you another warning. And you can either deselect or select Do Not Upgrade Servers, which is probably smart to not upgrade servers, to do them manually one at a time to make sure, or a small group at a time anyways, in a collection to make sure, because servers are always different, always have their own issues. So if there actually was a new, and it says within, automatically upgrade to clients within X number of days. And if you actually did use a test collection, you could select that collection here, but there's no newer version because I'm on the latest version, so I don't have that option. And there's also an option to exclude specific clients from the upgrade, as well as automatically distribute client installation package to distribution points that are enabled for pre-staged content. You might not want to do that if you have a slow WAN link again, because if you select that, it's going to try to distribute to the pre-staged distribution points. And again, you might have issues if it were intentionally a pre-staged distribution point because of speed issues. But that's how you would upgrade all the clients after testing to make sure there are no issues. And we haven't in any of my videos yet installed reporting services and taken a look at reports, but that is something that I'm going to be doing in another video. There is something called the SCCM reports on the client version, so you can monitor regularly to make sure that the clients are getting the latest version when you're going out into production with this. And if not, you can troubleshoot why not. It's a good indicator of how successful you're becoming with the client upgrade. And there's some advanced stuff we didn't talk about, like if you're using a failover cluster, there's certain considerations. You know, Microsoft has the articles on this step-by-step and all the considerations and configurations that you need for certain scenarios. So if you have a non-standard scenario where you're using a SQL Server failover cluster and you're doing an upgrade, there's certain steps for that. But other than that, that's pretty much it for updates. You know, you update the version of the site first, and that's done by as a review by checking to see what the updates or upgrades are available. And then you do the prerequisite check. You remediate any issues. You run it again. You install. You upgrade the consoles. And then you do a test on the upgrade of the client to a small group of computers. When everything tests out great in production environment, then you automatically push the new version of the client to all production computers. And that's it. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. I do provide additional materials that are exclusive on buymeacoffee.com. That link is on my description as well. Supporters and members get exclusive content and very, very useful stuff. Some stuff is free to the public, but I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.